Good afternoon and happy Friday. Welcome to our session on accelerating your career via your online presence. This year has brought many changes to our everyday lives and has disrupted the way we move through the world and interact with each other. For new grads and job seekers, it has also changed how we network and interview with prospective employers and has arguably put greater emphasis on how we present and package our accomplishments online. Today's session is about optimizing your online presence, and we'll also explore some strategies for networking in our online universe. This session is the first of a three-part series we are running in collaboration with Phase AI to help students and recent grads land the opportunities they are seeking. My name is Melissa Judd, and on behalf of everyone at Vector, thank you for spending some time with us today. I would like to begin by acknowledging and thanking our funders, the Province of Ontario, the Government of Canada through the Pan-Canadian AI Strategy, administered by CFAR, and industry sponsors from across the Canadian economy. I also wanted to pause to acknowledge the land on which Vector is located. In Toronto, what is now a meeting place for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, as well as newcomers to Canada from around the globe. The land we are situated on is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We are grateful to be hosted on this land. I would now like to introduce the co-founders of Phase AI who will be delivering today's webinar. But before I turn the screen over, I did want to say a couple of words about each of them. Wojciech Gryk is an AI researcher and data scientist and began his career working on social network analysis at IBM Research. He has also researched and built AI-driven products at organizations such as McKinsey, IBM, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University. He has MSc degrees in mathematical modeling and social science of the internet from the University of Oxford, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. He's also founded and sold a customer analytics startup focused on data integration and ML automation. Joining him is Andrea Yip, a scientist, designer, and researcher. Her career has focused on product design and research in clinical settings, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace. She has worked with organizations such as Johnson & Johnson, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and RBC, and has a Master of Public Health from the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming them here today.
Thank you very, very much for having us today. Thank you everyone for making the time to come to the webinar, and thank you of course to the Vector Institute for hosting us and giving us a chance to work with so many fantastic students and graduates. I'll be speaking for the next hour or so, but wanted to introduce Andrea as well, as she will be involved in the Q&A and will also be highly involved in both the portfolio sessions and the sessions on resume reviews for those who are participating in those. So Andrea, thank you so much for being here. Now I will just start sharing my screen here. So thank you again to everyone. And just as a very brief introduction for this section, really what we want to discuss today is about accelerating your career. How can you use your online presence, LinkedIn, resumes, portfolios, outreach, networking, etc., to really get the job that you're interested in, or put yourself on the path that is most aligned with your dreams and aspirations. Now, before we actually get started, I'll mention a few things. First, feel free to submit questions throughout the session itself. If we don't get to them through the session, then of course we'll definitely get to them at the end, or do our best to do so. Before we actually dive into all of the wonderful content as well, What I would like to do is give you a view from the company perspective. What are companies dealing with when it comes to hiring data scientists, analysts, machine learning researchers, or other data professionals? And both Andrea and I, via Phase and more broadly, have worked with numerous companies who are either hiring individual roles or potentially hiring entire teams of data scientists. And one recent example that came up literally 5 months ago is Dataco. Obviously, the name has been anonymized. But here are the numbers that they were dealing with when building out a team of about 4 data scientists. And when I say data scientists, I mean 2 data engineers, an ML engineer, and an ML researcher, so a range of roles. For those 4 roles, they received about 6,000 total applicants. Of those 6,000 applicants, about 1,000 of them actually applied for 2 or more roles. Beyond that, they went, of those 6,000, there were about 100 phone screens. Now, the first thing that I like to bring up here is just how large these numbers are and how difficult it can actually be to get from the initial application or submission of your resume, profile, etc., to the phone screening. Of the 100 phone screens, there were 10 interviews and 6 actual offers made. And of course, given the numbers, 2 people, for whatever reason, rejected their offers, or the offers didn't go through. Now, this funnel can seem fairly demotivating at times for folks, but the point and goal of this session, especially this very first one, is to talk about why are you great? Oftentimes, and you'll see here, the 1,000 applicants that applied for 2 or more roles, many people apply for lots of jobs, lots of different roles, and it's hard to stand out. And so the very first question that when we work with applicants and students and grads is to ask, well, what makes you great? How do you make it easy for the recruiter, the hiring manager, the company as a whole to really truly understand what makes you special? And that'll be the focus of this session. Next session on March 3rd, we'll be talking about why are you great for this role? How do you pick the right roles? How do you make sure that when you're actually going through the interview process itself and picking and promoting yourself and building your skills, how do you stand out? And of course, the final session is why are you the best fit? Why are you better than all 6,000 other applicants? Why are you better than any one of them in terms of your fit for this company, for this role, and for your broader career path and its alignment with the company itself? The way that we'll be discussing this today is, again, focusing on 3 areas. Oftentimes, the forgotten process is who are the actual people that you're dealing with when you're applying and moving through this process? In other words, who do you actually need to convince that you're great? And of course, how do you convince them? And how do you empathize with the challenges that they might actually be having when they're going through this process? The second is, how do you convince them? What is a good story when it comes to applications, when it comes to reaching out to individuals, or even being found potentially rather than reaching out? And this focuses on LinkedIn, resumes, portfolios. And last but certainly not least, we'll talk about the actual relationship building components. So networking, and especially within the context of COVID, how do you network remotely and in a way where you can build those meaningful relationships? So even when they don't necessarily lead to a job right away or an obvious placement, you'll have an opportunity in a network to build that later. And how do you de-risk everything? How do you make it as easy as possible for the employer or the recruiter, hiring manager actually to look at your profile and say, this person's perfect, I want to work with them, and hopefully they want to work with me. So to begin, who do you need to convince? And there's really 4 key players or groups of players when it comes to the application process. And I think this is particularly, while this is true for all companies really and all roles, I think there are very particular and unique components here when it comes to data science roles. The first is the recruiter. This could be an internal or external person. We'll talk about them later. The hiring manager we'll focus on in a bit as well, but they're usually the person that is responsible for the role itself, or might actually be your boss or manager if you get hired. There is the broader team and the company as a whole. Now, the team and company typically don't come into this process early on, so we won't be talking about them today, but rest assured that in the next sessions, we will be covering how you convince the whole team and the company that you're perfect for them. So deep diving into the recruiter, that's the individual that has to deal with all 6,000 candidates when they post the jobs. They're usually posting multiple job postings, especially if it's a growing larger company. And they actually have to do their best to review all 6,000 candidates in some form. Now, this could be an internal recruiter, and what that means is it's a recruiter that actually is working, is an employee of the company that's hiring for these roles. They could also be external, in which case it might be a consultant or some sort of professional services individual or provider that is doing this just for the specific roles. Now, putting ourselves in this person's shoes, just think about the amount of time this takes. If they literally just spend 1 minute per candidate, that's already more time than they can possibly commit to reviewing everybody, right? Which means on the flip side that you don't have a lot of time to convince this person that you are great and you should be hopping on a phone screen. The phone screens themselves tend to be a bit longer. 30 minutes is a very common number here. Sometimes they're a bit shorter, sometimes they're a full hour. But even here, if you think about an hour-long phone screen, that's already 2.5 weeks of work if the recruiter is doing nothing else during a 40-hour work week. So you know that they're really not able to cover everything just because of the numbers themselves. So again, how do you make it as easy as possible for them to see your value and how wonderful you are? Now, there's 2 other really important points when it comes to recruiters. Typically, they're not that technical. Very, very few companies have highly technical recruiters who come from the background that they're hiring for, whether that's biotech or data science or software engineering. So oftentimes they're using heuristics to make a decision about you as an individual. You are almost certainly the subject matter expert on that call when it comes to a data science role. The other thing that's very, very important here is their compensation is usually tied, and their own career progression, I should say, is tied to finding the best people as fast as possible. Internally, the numbers they're looking at are things like time to hire or quality of hire. So what they really want to do is get the role filled in as few days as possible, which oftentimes, thinking about it from a data science perspective, means they really want to minimize false positives that get weeded out later on in the interview process. And their reputation within the company really stands on the fact that they are sending the right candidates that look interesting to the hiring manager. But remember, they're not technical. So this is actually a really difficult problem. How do I know whether a person is legitimately awesome when I might not actually appreciate their technical expertise or I might not be able to relate to it? So a big part of your online profile and the stories you tell and the way you tell them is about convincing the recruiter that you are going to do well in the interview afterwards. Now, there's also the hiring manager, and the hiring manager oftentimes is the person that will run with the application post recruiter. The recruiter oftentimes will in many cases, often actually remove themselves from the process fully when it comes to the later stages of the interview. Now, the hiring manager might do phone screenings as well. They'll sometimes do even resume screens. But remember those numbers, the 6,000 people that are applying. The hiring manager has a full-time job, typically, that is not hiring. They actually have to deliver projects. They have to oversee a broader team. So they really don't have a lot of time here. And on the flip side, they might actually have a lot of other priorities that are nagging away at them when they're on a call with you. The reason they're involved in the entire process when it comes to a screening and reviewing applicants is that you'll probably be working with them. Oftentimes the hiring manager is going to be the actual manager of the role, or the boss of the team, or the team lead in some forms. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's one step removed, or maybe even one step above, so that this is your boss's boss potentially. But ultimately, they are definitely aware of the problem they're trying to solve. They want to minimize the risk of bringing you on board. They're spending a lot of time here. And most importantly, I think, in terms of empathizing with this role, is they're not actually compensated for whether or not you get hired the way a recruiter is. They're usually compensated, or their career progression depends on a project's success. So this might be someone who has this great modeling project or a product they want to launch, and they've decided, and the company has decided at some point, that hiring you for this role will somehow make it easier, better, faster, more likely that whatever project that is, that it'll succeed. And so again, thinking about it from your perspective with the hiring manager, you want to convince the hiring manager that by joining the team, you will ultimately make it more likely that that project will be successful, and that they will be successful, and of course that you'll be successful as a result. So to begin, how do you convince them? How do you actually tell the recruiter why you're so awesome when they're maybe not so technical, or convince the hiring manager that you will make sure the projects that you'll be working on will be successful? And before we talk about LinkedIn and resumes and wonderful things like that, I'll start at a very high level, which is tell a good story. This is critical when it comes to both convincing the recruiter as well as convincing the hiring manager that you're a fantastic individual. And one of the things that this means is having a vision for yourself. You want to know where you're going. And the title of this talk is accelerating your career via your online presence, But really the first question is, where are you accelerating your career? Why do you want to accelerate your career? How far should it go? In what direction? If you don't know where you want to be going, it's very difficult to actually get anywhere interesting, right? And what this ultimately means, if you think about it from a slightly different perspective, the tactical question that I would encourage every one of you to have is, what is your vision for 2022? So a year away, let's say, 2025, 45 years away, and 2030, a decade out. What is the vision for yourself? And the reason you want to tell a good story here is, I'll be honest with you, I've probably hired hundreds of data scientists in different forms at this point. I don't remember most resumes. Actually, I don't remember any resumes, to be perfectly frank, but I remember the people who showed up and had a really interesting story, experience, project, vision, opinion that resonated with me. And those are the things that even after working with them or after moving on in our careers, I still come back to them in some form, because I'm like, that person was really interesting. That was really cool. Or, hey, did they ever do the thing they were going to do 10 years from now, 10 years ago? And that's so important, and it's so much easier to remember. Now, the other piece here that's important, this isn't about self-actualization. When I say having a vision for yourself, I think it's important to be grounded and thoughtful and intentional in your career advancement, applications, etc. But at the same time, what's really important here is the fact that this is about marketing. It's not about showing how you'll self-actualize to your potential employer, but rather it is about marketing yourself, showing them that you are going to kick butt in the role. And what that typically means is, going back to the point around telling a good story, it's also aligning your story with the story that your hiring manager might want to tell, or that the company is trying to tell. So when it comes to marketing yourself, there's three things that we typically look for. And everything here, I would say, is things that you can practice with a friend, you can practice with a colleague. You don't need to do this necessarily with a professional individual. The first is having a 30-second elevator pitch. And when I say 30-second pitch, it's why are you great, going back to that point, but really, what is that vision for yourself? In 30 seconds, what are you working on? Why is it exciting for you? And why are you excited to be in that space? The more inspiring and motivated you can be about this, again, the more people will remember. The important part here about the 30-second piece is that this is the story that you want to tell very quickly when you hop on the phone screen or when you hop on that initial introduction with the hiring manager. Going back to those numbers, the 6,000 applicants, the 100 phone screens, most of the recruiters that I've worked with or collaborated with in some ways will actually say that they'll make the decision on whether the person seems to be right for the role in the first 3, 4, 5 minutes of the phone call. So after the pleasantries, after the initial kickoff for that phone screen, they hear the applicants start telling their story. Oftentimes they already get a gut feel. They do pattern recognition, whether that's consciously or subconsciously, where they can see, okay, this person looks like someone that can probably work on the problems here and will be able to present and lead and do interesting things at my company. The second piece is a 5-minute career overview. And the idea behind this, of course, is oftentimes when you tell them where you're going, they also want to know where you're coming from. Who are you and why? What have you been up to so far, and why are you so interesting? This is, again, meant to be very, very quick, not necessarily thorough. You don't want to read your full CV, but pick out a few really interesting points that you think will resonate for that specific role or for that specific individual. Finally, the 5-minute vision for the future. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, this is very much about marketing. So it's not necessarily the things that just get you out of bed, although it's important to bring those up and to be genuine when you share your vision. But really, what the company, the hiring manager, the recruiter, what they're looking for is there vision alignment? If you're really excited about a certain research topic, does that actually apply to the job that you're applying for, or can it in some way? If you have some really interesting broader ideas in terms of markets, geographical experience, where you think the world is going, how does that actually apply to the job? Because oftentimes if it doesn't, then it's a great story and people might be excited and interested, but they won't be able to pound their fists on the table to say, this is the person that we want to bring on board, because it might be too generic or too disconnected from the actual role itself. A few principles to keep in mind when it comes to actually doing this well. The first is be promotional. And when I say promotional here, there's this concept, without getting too researchy, on regulatory mindsets. And some people like to think big vision and exciting stuff, and other people tend to be more risk-oriented, where they reduce risk and like consistency. As much as you can, really try to focus on this promotional, positive outlook and vision. A lot of companies really struggle finding employees, particularly, I would say, on the technical side, that are aware of risks and technical details, but feel like things are possible and they want to push ahead and be better every day and want to build towards a grand vision. And this is something, again, that you can practice. That's really important. The other piece here is what I would say, pithy uniqueness. Try to be obviously short, concise, but also try to make it unique. There's a lot of people that I meet that say, they want to be data scientists because it's a growing field, and they feel their career prospects, are going to be fantastic in this space. That's 100% true, but there's so many folks that mention that it's difficult to remember if there's anyone in particular that has actually said that to me. And on the flip side, if someone comes in and says, I've been working on this really cool project in computer vision, or analyzing economic history, or whatever it is, it's easier to remember in some ways. Again, most importantly, show how this helps your target. If you can connect your promotional, unique vision to what the company is actually trying to do, that also tells the story. Because putting ourselves back in the recruiter's shoes, What they never want to do, the thing that keeps them up at night oftentimes is that they send candidates over where the hiring manager, the broader company says, why the heck did you send those to me? And that's the worst thing that a recruiter could hear about individual candidates. And so the flip side is, if they can, even though they're going to be wrong, it's impossible to be right every time. If they can say, well, here's why this candidate is awesome, or when they're actually booking the meeting with the hiring manager and they say, okay, great, you're going to get a 1 hour long calendar invitation with candidate X. Here's why they're wonderful. And the other piece that I'll throw in here, which is more of a strategy across the board, particularly in the unique situation where you might be interviewing with multiple people. Sometimes you might have 2 phone screens, or you might meet the hiring manager or the recruiter at a hiring event, and then you might apply and actually have a phone call. Is for the stories that you share, try to have multiple stories that emphasize what it is you're trying to achieve. So the idea here would be, let's say you meet with the recruiter and you meet with the hiring manager, tell them 2 different stories. Now the theme, the message, your vision for yourself should be consistent. And again, it's important to always be genuine, but tell them 2 different experiences when they ask about where this is coming from or how this could work. Because when they debrief, they will now be learning about you still, because they'll be sharing stories about you. They'll be evangelizing you because one person heard one story, the other person heard the other story. So they continue to learn about you and see what an interesting individual you are after you've actually concluded your phone call. This is particularly critical as well in the settings where you might be meeting with the team, doing an on-site interview, because you'll be meeting tons of people, and I can assure you they will all be sitting down and debriefing about you afterwards. Now, I'll just stop here briefly to see if there are any questions that have come up that are relevant, and one of the ones that has particularly within this context is, how do you check that your story or vision aligns with what the organization is looking for? And the second around this, and I'll cover both of these, is how do you focus your pitch on different audiences, a recruiter versus a hiring manager versus a business leader? These are fantastic questions. Thank you for submitting them. So the first piece on how do you check that your story and vision aligns with what the organization is looking for is so important. There are 2 or 3 things that I will typically encourage people to do here. The first one is, when you're applying for a role, learn what the company does. Believe it or not, I've interviewed so many people where when I ask them, do you have any questions for me in a phone screen, they very clearly either ask, what does the company do? How does it work? Or simply don't know. And you could tell because they're not really getting detailed in terms of the company. And that's always surprising to me. And so part of this, I would say, is do your research on the company, understand the products more broadly. It's easy to do research on Google or Glassdoor, for example. You could explore what are some of the challenges this company is facing. Number 2 is, if you know who your hiring manager will be or who's involved in the process, sometimes job descriptions and job postings actually list the names of the individuals. See what they're active on in social media. Most senior people within companies are very active on LinkedIn, maybe on Twitter. They probably speak at conferences or events. So you could actually see what are they like and what seems to be top of mind for them, and try to connect your vision to them. And I'll also be honest here, if you're really struggling with that, or if you're getting a bad read on the person for whatever reason, it also probably means that maybe you shouldn't be working there. And that's okay too. Remember, you're interviewing the company as much as the company is interviewing you. The last piece that I will say here is also reading into the job description. And we'll talk a little bit about this in our future sessions, but one of the things that I feel a lot of people miss from an opportunity perspective is when they look at a job description, they see the job title. It says data scientist or data engineer or whatever. They're like, yes, that's the job for me. Then they go straight to the requirements. And of course, you should be reading the requirements at some point. That's critical, of course. But what they miss is, what are you going to be doing on the job? And and what does success look like? And that is literally where the company at some point, the recruiter, hiring manager, et cetera, sat down and said, you know what, we're going to present all of this and tell you what success looks like so that maybe you could do something with it. And most candidates don't. They usually say, yes, 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 this company does X and Y, interesting, great, what are my requirements? Can I get this job? And so when it comes to actually telling your story, try to wrap back to those broader goals. And a very common example, again, we'll dive into this later, but is the title data scientist. Sometimes that's an internal consulting role that has nothing to do with product. Sometimes it's a pure product role where you're actually working and building product. Same title, same requirements probably. In both cases, you might be building models and doing and putting together communications based on your analysis, but the success looks vastly different. In terms of how do you present yourself well to different roles, what I would say here is going back to the idea of having that 30-second vision for yourself, or elevator pitch, excuse me. Try to have a few different ones. And again, you want to be as genuine as possible here, but the stories that you use to emphasize your success might be different, or to emphasize your vision might be different. And the other piece here is you might also want to practice the level of technical detail that you go into here. So usually if I'm working with a candidate and trying to coach them on how to be successful, you know, if the recruiter is less technical, it might be a little bit more about having that high level view of what's been successful in your career so far, how you achieve projects or timelines, delivery dates, whatever. But for a technical hiring manager, you might actually want to go into some of those details, get a little jargony, but with the caveat of not too jargony, so that you could tell the right story. But you'll see that in all of these cases, what you really want to do is prepare ahead of time, have multiple stories, and rehearse all of this. And again, you don't need to rehearse with a professional hiring manager or coach or whatever. Do this with a friend that doesn't know everything about you when it comes to your career. And if they can't summarize your 30-second pitch back to you in the way that you thought they should, then you're probably missing some key elements. So the other piece, of course, here, and a critical one, is LinkedIn and actually working on your online profile. So there's a few pieces at a high level that I'll talk about before getting very tactical in terms of what to focus on, what to look at. First, don't rush. Oftentimes what people will do when they're starting their job search is they'll get really, really, really active early on. And even I think sometimes a common, I don't want to call it a strategy, but a common approach, decision-making approach, is they'll even accept the first job that they get. They worry about negotiating too hard. They worry about looking around. And so the first piece is start this as soon as possible in terms of putting together your profile, but also take your time. See what's out there, see what kind of profiles are coming up, apply more passively even for roles early on. And the piece around here that's important too is invite people to find you. If you don't have a LinkedIn profile, there's no way people will find you. If you don't have a Google Scholar profile, academically oriented hiring managers or recruiters probably will struggle finding you. If you, well, we'll talk about photos and other things in the LinkedIn profile in a minute, but there's a lot of pieces here on how do you extend that invitation. And of course, demonstrate your value. Show that you're ambitious, excited, keen, inspiring. And part of that is being active in all of these places. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be active everywhere and constantly posting and sharing content, but being intentional and thoughtful about things that are interesting, or even reaching out to people that you think are interesting is a good way to do it. When it comes to any of the messaging that we talk about here, we like to use this idea of the JET framework, which is jargon, avoid it as much as you can. Now, obviously, that's not always possible, but I can tell you that most people probably aren't as technical as you are when it comes to a lot of the topics you might have worked on in the past, particularly if you come from a research background. So making it real for people and understandable is very, very important. The second is end-to-end projects. Data science in particular, I feel, is moving in an interesting direction now, where because so many people have such vastly different backgrounds, sometimes people finish undergrad and do a data science boot camp and apply for a data scientist position. In other cases, someone with a PhD and a postdoc in comp sci applies for that same role. People from vastly different backgrounds and experiences might be doing this. So the way that a lot of employers and companies now look to understand what a candidate is capable of is by seeing what are the end-to-end projects that they've actually worked on and shipped. Now, this could mean collecting data and publishing a research paper. It could mean actually shipping a product that you built from scratch by yourself. Ultimately, what it boils down to is explaining what you built and why it was interesting very quickly. And lastly, be top down. This is particularly important for people who do come from technical backgrounds, because oftentimes technology, research, academia requires you to be fairly deep, right? And so you start in the details and you build out a solution to a problem, a vision, or whatever else. But the challenge there is that it's very, very difficult to be bottom-up, detail-oriented, and still give a 30-second explanation or overview of what you've done. So start at the top. What was the big idea that you worked on? Why was it important? And then invite the person to get into the details. Do they want to know the details, or are they happy to have heard the high-level view and that's it? So let's start with a profile that maybe is less than ideal when it comes to LinkedIn and some of these frameworks that we've been talking about. Oftentimes, when people create LinkedIn profile, they'll start here. They have to fill in their details. And honestly, as I'm sure you know, it can be quite tedious putting in everything you've ever done into yet another platform. And so the thing that we really encourage people to avoid, however, is this sort of high-level overview that doesn't really say very much about the person. And you want to fill things in as much as possible, and we'll be talking about some of those details in a minute. But a few things that I would start with in terms of avoiding is well, lack of detail, number one. Number two is the hashtag open to work. And this is a really interesting one and sometimes controversial, well, definitely controversial, but one of the things that we've been hearing from a lot of recruiters in particular is that while they respect and appreciate the hashtag, it also tells them a lot about where the person is at. And, and so it makes them feel like, okay, maybe this person is struggling finding work, so maybe they're not as great as they say they are, because great people should probably be employed, right? And I'm not saying that's actually always true, of course, but that's how someone who, again, has 30 seconds to review 1,000 different applications for a role, they don't have a lot of time to think about this stuff. The other thing that really throws people off is when it says hashtag open to work and they have a full-time job that they say they're at right now, because there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there. It's like, well, are you telling everyone publicly you're looking for a job, yet you're currently at a job? So how will this work if I hire you? So it actually, so the typical advice that we often get here is just don't include it at all. The second thing is these terms aspiring, or sometimes we see things like data science enthusiast. These are not bad words to use when maybe you're talking with folks in a slightly less professional or more social setting. But one of the big challenges here is when I'm a hiring manager, I don't want to hire an aspiring data scientist. I want to hire a data scientist who's going to kick butt. I don't want to hire a data science enthusiast. I want to hire someone who's a data science professional. And professionals aren't enthusiasts. They're not aspiring. They've done this before. De-risk yourself, right? That's very important. The other piece here is connections. Believe it or not, a lot of recruiters and hiring managers will also filter out people that have less than 500 connections. Certainly, if they only have dozens of connections, that's a particular problem. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, there are a lot of bots on LinkedIn, and I think this is particularly true since COVID, lots of activity online. And so they want to know they're dealing with a genuine person, number one. Number two, if you've been on LinkedIn for a while, if you're in an academic setting where there's thousands of students, why is no one adding you to LinkedIn, and why are you not adding anyone to LinkedIn? Should I avoid adding you to LinkedIn if I'm a recruiter? I'm not really sure anymore. And so that's, so extending that invitation, I think implicitly means 500 plus connections. Again, I'm not saying go out and start adding every single person you've ever met or random people on LinkedIn. That'll get you banned, believe it or not. But rather, again, extend invitations, reach out to people when you do go to events, and whether they're online events or eventually, again, physical events, add people. And finally, have an about section that mimics and reinforces your 30-second vision for yourself. So learning to become a data scientist isn't really all that great. I want to know, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I'm assuming you're going to become a data scientist. That's great. What else? That's really important. And so here's an example of a profile that we really like. That includes all these details. 500 plus connections. When, by the way, I should mention, there is a photo. One thing that a lot of recruiters really dislike is having LinkedIn profiles with no photo at all. And a big part of that is, again, they feel like it's very impersonal. And it actually makes them nervous reaching out to them, believe it or not. An about section that is both explaining, in this case, Laura's experience, but also gets pretty technical, or not technical, excuse me, but pretty concrete without getting jargony, and really shows what her outcomes are. Oh, she's built NLP models for e-commerce retailers. She's worked on custom recommendations. I'm assuming that's probably for products. Wow, okay, so I can get a picture of what kind of things Laura works on. And more importantly, if she's applying for a job that deals with customer analytics, product recommendations, e-commerce, retail, I probably want to talk to her. Because you know what? She sounds like she could at least pass a screening call, if nothing more, if I'm the recruiter. And having this level of detail, but not too much more, I would say is the right is the right level. Now, the other piece that that often comes up is around portfolios. But before I go there, one of the things that, well, I'll just stop here for a few questions that have come up as well. So one is around letting recruiters know you're looking. That's okay. That's different because it's a lot more subtle, and usually broader employers and your employer won't be informed of this. So I would say that's a little better. It's when you make it very publicly visible that it's a problem. And in terms of using JET for cover letters, 100%. And in fact, the cover letter question is a really great segue into portfolios, because while writing a cover letter is often required and is important, I can also tell you that it is probably one of the more tedious things to read, because again, I've got a minute or two to review a portfolio or an application, excuse me, and reading 5 paragraphs, or here are my options, right? Reading the cover letter, 5 paragraphs, looking at your LinkedIn profile, or looking at a resume. I'll probably go to the LinkedIn, excuse me. And why will I go to the LinkedIn? Because it's standardized. So right away, my pattern matching part of the brain is allowing me to very quickly filter, see what I'm looking for. Resumes actually can make that a little more difficult. So often recruiters will start there. So for the cover letter, make it as easy as possible. Don't make it long. Follow the JET framework, really focus on why you're great. And again, have it all reinforced. If your cover letter is inconsistent with your LinkedIn, and if both of them are inconsistent with the screening call, that usually sets off a lot of red flags. And so you want to be careful with that. Now, that being said, why did I say that the cover letter is a good segue into portfolios? I would actually say that the portfolio is often the thing that really gets people excited, particularly hiring managers. So as you think about presenting yourself, really focus on those end-to-end projects, and focus on showing the hiring manager and the recruiter how you can deliver on solving a problem or a product or whatever else. And one of the things that I'll mention on the LinkedIn side of things, we don't have the actual screenshot here, but LinkedIn, excuse me, does allow you to have featured posts and portfolio components. So that's a great place to include a few of your better, more interesting, more exciting portfolio components. And I'll show you what that actually means. So first, what is a portfolio, and why is this a thing nowadays when it comes to data science? And the biggest challenge, and when it comes, I think, to data science, recruiting, and career pathing today, and I think this will change in 5 to 10 years, but certainly today this is a problem, is that it is a really broad topic. A biotech researcher building business cases in a pharma setting can call themselves a data scientist. An ML researcher can call themselves a data scientist. A data analyst working on Excel spreadsheets at a bank can call themselves a data scientist. And so as a result, employers and I'm sure candidates and applicants like yourselves really struggle with distinguishing and finding the roles that are right for them. And on the flip side, actually showing why they're the right fit for a role that might be defined very broadly. And the way that people are starting to get around this is by looking at the projects that you've worked on in the past. That does two things. The first is it shows me you can ship products, projects, and solve problems. It's amazing how often, particularly for more junior roles, people will hire a data scientist and learn that this might be the first time they've done anything applied. And that's a very excruciating experience for everyone involved if that's a surprise to them. And so seeing that you've done something interesting before is important. Number two, a portfolio in many ways does almost by definition follow this JET framework. To look at this example here with Jonathan, there's no jargon because they're images, right? So that's great. They're top down because you need a title. And of course, more importantly, I would say the portfolio should focus on highlighting your capabilities and also specifically include projects and ideas that are relevant to the job that you're applying for. Now, before I talk about ways to think about your portfolio and show you examples, what I'll just very quickly say is here's a checklist that we often like to follow when it comes to helping people through their portfolio. And this is, of course, for the folks participating in the portfolio sessions. This is something that we'll really be going through. The first is feature your strongest projects, the projects that really show you and your contribution and why you are great, going back to the start of this presentation. The second piece is use a consistent framework. It's really difficult to, again, especially if you don't have a lot of time, to review multiple types of projects that are presented in different ways. It just leads to a lot of confusion. So oftentimes what happens then is the recruiter or hiring manager might only review one, and it might be the wrong one. It might be the one they're most comfortable with. So make it as easy as possible for you to show off and to guide the recruiter, hiring manager through your portfolio. Emphasize your specific role and contribution, particularly if this was a team project. Show your end result. Of course, again, it's much easier to show what you've done at the end. Visual cues are great. You'll see some examples of this. Try to summarize your project in 3 sentences. Going back again, everything, 30-second pitch, 3 sentences, really short. Minimize jargon. Most people visiting your portfolio are probably not subject matter experts in your field. And so if ideally there's something visual that convinces them or shows them why this is great, but if not, then describe this in a way that you would describe it to someone in a completely different space. And last but not least, employer specific optimizations. So if you are applying for a role that is your dream role, that is like literally when you think about your 10-year vision, this is where you want to be because it's the thing that sets you on the path and accelerates you to where you want to go. You might want to create a customized landing page just for that employer. And I can tell you, if I'm in a recruiting role or a hiring manager role, and I see that someone's done that, they're almost certainly getting a phone call. Because I know they're putting in the effort, the time, the energy to convince me specifically, why they're amazing to work with. And if they're doing that now, I can only imagine what it's going to be like actually working with them. So here are some examples of portfolios that we really like or that emphasize some of these components. And after the session, we'll be sharing some of these links as well so that you can return to them. But So this is an example of a data visualization for different types of songs that are labeled based on emotional state. What's really cool about this is it's actually, you could put in the artist's name and it'll actually highlight the plots in a different way based on the songs that the artist has. And you could actually even listen to a brief preview of the song itself. So when I see something like this, I'm like, you know what? This person can ship product. They can write code and they can make interesting, pretty data visualizations. How cool is that? Here's an example of a very technical portfolio. And this is actually one that doesn't necessarily follow all of the things that I mentioned earlier. But the reason that I actually really like it is the data visualization. Because what it's actually showing is the overlays of what the individual has been calculating. In this case, once we actually got to know the individual, they're actually estimating the direction and the velocity of the fluid flow based on these images. And so that visualization, I'm like, wow, that's basically what you're doing. Really cool. And now, if this person's applying for a computer vision role, for example, I can tell you they're probably getting a phone call. Another approach that you might want to take is actually having a video, or again, some way where you present. And more broadly, really due to COVID, more and more employers in general are moving to video interviews now. This is another trend that's happening, just again, for obvious reasons. We're not going to be able to meet face to face, so why don't we do the screening call as a Zoom call or a Google Hangout or whatever else? The way you could de-risk that is by actually having a quick video on your portfolio, or if rather than say writing out the 30-second or 3-sentence overview of what you've done, you might actually just want to record yourself saying it. Especially if you're a great communicator, if there's something visual about it, you're going to stand out. In a similar way, having really neat visualizations. This is a good example of one where it's obviously sales funnel. This is the visualization that if I'm looking to hire someone, and again, marketing analytics or sales enablement, this would actually really appeal to me. And so that could be a really nice targeted example. Now, another one that I really like is Brandon's here, where this is actually a good example of one where we often get the question of, well, I don't have a lot of data, I haven't been able to label a public data set, or something along those lines. This is an example where someone literally built a visualization of rock, paper, scissors and has a neat interface in terms of tracking predictions and tracking around the outcome of the game, and visualizing the results. I can tell you they didn't need to label anything, but they can visualize, they can ship product, they can put it up on a website and explain what it does. I'll take it. This is great. The other thing that I'll say here very broadly, and particularly again for roles where you'll be writing code, is GitHub as a portfolio. So oftentimes when we ask people for a portfolio, they'll send us their GitHub link. And there's technically nothing wrong with that, but I would say that it shows that you're not necessarily, particularly if it's just listing your projects, and I have to figure out what is it, what the heck did you do, or did you just simply clone or fork a repository? What I really like in this case is Sydney went out of her way to actually put together a portfolio on LinkedIn, but like she actually, not LinkedIn, on GitHub, where she actually explains that she guides me through it. So I can still see her repositories, I can see the packages, I can click on her links, but more importantly, she's just guiding me the whole time. So she's making it really easy for me to understand what's going on. Another example is cleaning up and making your Google Scholar profile easy to read. Now, I realize not all of us are Jeff Hinton, but just making sure that we actually fill in what papers you've published, if you have published papers, linking to your homepage, really important here. This is, again, really critical, especially if you are looking for an academic role, like being an ML researcher or a research-oriented data scientist. If you aren't publishing, if you're not spending a lot of time on here, but you think your employer or potential employer might end up on your Google Scholar page, link to your homepage. That is the best approach. At the very least, you tell them, look, like, I'm aware, here's my page, click here to learn about me, because now, again, you're making it easier for me to find you and review what you're doing. Here's another example, actually, from Andrea, where she actually designed a full customer journey or astronaut journey for Blue Origin as a way to build a relationship with them. And this is a really good example of having employer-specific portfolio components. Again, you're not going to do this for 100 jobs that you're applying to, but if there are 1 or 2 jobs that are really, really exciting to you and really, really interesting, another way to really stand out is not only customizing your portfolio page for that employer, but actually going all out and having something that is a unique deliverable to them, because it shows that you are an expert on their product, you are an expert on their business. It'll be so easy to work with you. So of course they'll want to work with you. The last example that we have here is actually a design firm, and the reason we wanted to share it is, when you're planning out your portfolio and how to present it, don't necessarily limit yourself to seeing what other data scientists have done. It's also possible to see what design firms are doing. How are they presenting themselves? Because it'll allow you to get a view into what really beautiful portfolios look like, and what a compelling portfolio could look like. Now, lastly, when it comes to portfolios, what I'll say is the frameworks. The high-level principle, in addition to JET, that I would really encourage people here is guide the people visiting your portfolios. Make it as easy for them as possible to go through this without having to figure out where to go or what to click or what to read, because the minute you do that, they're going to spend more time figuring things out rather than learning about why you're great. The second piece is have a consistent framework. We worry less about what that framework is and more about just consistency. So one example is having a role, a problem, a solution. So what was I doing? What was the problem? How did we solve it? And then you get to the technical piece. So you'll notice that top-down approach. The second example could be if you have a demo, you start with a demo. Show, don't tell is a fantastic way to organize your portfolios, because people are typically visual. Seeing what you've shipped or done is really great. And then you could talk about your problem solution, the skills you've used, etc. Another example of this that we've seen one data scientist use is the sizzle steak recipe ingredients. You start with the thing that really gets people exciting and their mouths watering. Then you tell them it's a steak, but you only get to the recipe ingredients after they've decided they want that. As you do all of this networking, as you put all of this together and build your portfolio, build your LinkedIn, work on your Google Scholar page, the other question, of course, that comes up is how do you build relationships? And I've already talked a little bit about just extending an invitation and really being intentional with your activity and outreach to show people that that you're open, that you want to chat with them. The other important piece, of course, is how do you reach out to people, especially right now. And I would say the most common thing today that we see when it comes to reaching out to individuals and is networking via cold emails, cold LinkedIn messages, etc. And what I will say here is, going back to this idea of intentionality and people being really busy, what we really want to emphasize is when you reach out to an individual, really try to show why you're worth having a conversation with, or why you've spent time learning about them and thinking about them. The example on the left here, can we chat over coffee, is the type of message that I get literally 20 or 30 of these after events like this. So even if I were able to do that, that's literally now a full week of work potentially of having coffees. And I can tell you that if I did that, the person who's getting the third, fourth, fifth coffee is probably not having a great experience anymore. What I look for instead, and what we really encourage people to do here, is when you reach out, first, again, assume the person's busy. They might not have the time to to meet with you, but they probably do have time to read the message that you're sending them. So explaining to that who you are, again, really short, pithy, value proposition, having links to your resume or portfolio, and explaining to them why you're reaching out. Having a chat over coffee, again, you're making me really try to figure out why. Are you applying for a job? Maybe you're going to try to sell me something. I just don't know. On the right here, I know you're looking for a role. I know you're into NLP. I have your resume link. I have your portfolio link. Lisa, you're great. Maybe I won't reply to you. Hopefully I will. Maybe I won't have time to meet with you, but at least I know your portfolio. And if it resonates with me, or if we're hiring an NLP modeling individual or a data scientist focusing on NLP, I can forward this on to the right people. So you've just made my job so much easier, because it'll take me less time to forward your email or message than it will for me to reply and say I'm not interested. So I might as well do that. And I realize we're coming up to the end of the event, so there's a few common scenarios that I will very briefly go through. When I do this, of course, if you want me to elaborate in the Q&A, feel free to do so. The first is new to Canada. We have a lot of people who have recently arrived and are looking for work, or looking to start within data science roles, and this is often a concern for them. One of the things that I really emphasize here, if this is a concern for you, I will say really. And I know this is harder to say than harder to do than it is to say, but really try not to let it get to you too much. I find many employers in Canada are very open to hiring new arrivals. The biggest question that they will often ask, particularly the recruiter, is, are you actually able to legally work here? And obviously, if you're going through an academic program, or if you have a work permit or a green card, the answer is yes. Just make it easy for them. Get that out of the way. At that point, they're going to treat you like every other applicant. Where this really falls through, and where a lot of people have a pet peeve, is if you don't have the ability to work here, you don't tell anyone until the offer stage, at which point maybe there's a reason why the employer can't hire you, or it has to become an extremely complicated process for them that they may or may not be aware of or familiar with. Applied experience. Actually, I'm going to talk about applied experience. So if you're coming from a non-academic environment, industry experience, where maybe you're pivoting from a different space, and hybrid careers, I'll talk about them all in one go, just because we don't have a lot of time. The idea here is you're not a data science by training, or you haven't spent your entire life since kindergarten preparing to be a data scientist. That's okay. And the way that I often encourage people to present themselves here is to really frame that experience as a strength. I'll give you a few examples. It's really difficult to find data scientists who have customer service experience. Most data scientists are technical, and I love finding data scientists who are comfortable talking to customers and building solutions with them. I will hire pretty much any of them, because there's so few of them, and they're so good with the people side, they're comfortable with the data side, they are a bridge to everyone. Another example is that I often like to think about here is product management. So, and this is industry specific typically. So product management in biotech, product management in software, whatever it is. If you're shifting into data science or a technical role, one of the things that is impossible to hire for today is data-driven product managers. These are basically people who are product managers who are building data-driven products. So either software that analyzes data, or maybe software that depends on data. Those people, literally, I think I can count them on one hand in terms of who I've met that can actually do that well. And whenever I meet those folks, everyone wants to talk to them. So the goal here really is try to reframe your challenges or the things that might make you slightly insecure into a strength, because then not only do you hit it and address it head on, but you actually make it a compelling part of your story. It's really cool to meet someone who's gone from biotech and now into data science, especially right now. I mean, there's so many things to talk about with them. So I'll stop here. So thank you all very much for taking the time. If you do have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. At Phase AI, we also have lots of different webinars that we recorded in the past and content. So if you have specific things that you're looking to address, they might be on the site, but definitely feel free to reach out to us and we can point you in the right direction. And of course, once again, thank you to the Vector Institute for having us and for giving us a chance to connect with so many wonderful people. And I think we do have a few minutes for questions, so I will stop my screen and happy to see or answer any or as many of them as I possibly can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Wojciech. That was great and a lot of content. And I actually think that the last few slides are several questions around, highlighting the right skill sets, especially if you're making pivots. I think that's something that we can definitely address in some of the future webinars, but it's great to get your take on that too. For these questions, actually, we had quite a few around portfolios. So I just want to start there because there's a lot of discussion around, building a portfolio and, how to actually leverage the right platforms to create one. So a couple of questions around this, what platforms would you use to build a portfolio?
Sure. I think, so first and foremost, I would say I've never really judged people for having any specific platform. So first and foremost, whatever you're comfortable with that will really make you shine, start there. I really like GitHub, however, because it allows, so first of all, there's a tool, a part of GitHub called GitHub Pages, where you can fully essentially build a website on GitHub. It's probably one of the easiest ways to build a website on GitHub. And what I really like there is people going out of their way to build a website rather than simply sending me to a page. Beyond that, WordPress is a good place to go, especially because they have lots of different themes and things like that. But really, whatever is easiest for you.
Awesome. And, for a lot of folks here, there's a lot of new grads, a lot of folks who have been working on school-based projects. How do you start building up a portfolio as a new grad? There was a question around, this person's been working with a group of folks in their master's degree. Is it okay to use that type of project in this type of portfolio, even if they might have not been involved in some of the bigger decision making? What can someone include?
Great question. So I'll answer that in a few ways. First, I think as long as the data and the work is publicly shareable, and of course, in the case of schoolwork or going through a boot camp or whatever, typically you should be able to share that. So that's a great place to start. I think the thing you really want to look for there is two things. One is make sure that the project you pick is something that emphasizes and really presents you as in a powerful, strong way. And one of my pet peeves here is that with boot camps, with master's programs in some cases, is that they'll often have similar projects year to year and group to group. So what happens then when I get an application is, let's say I have 3 people from the same program or boot camp applying, they literally have the same portfolio. And I can't tell what their contribution was. And I also can't tell what came out of the curriculum versus what did they actually do. And so again, at that point I start doubting everything, because if that's the best project that you could pick and they all look the same, then that's really difficult for me to really understand your value. The other thing I'll say is, these projects, sometimes people get worried. They're like, okay, do I have 3 months to build this crazy thing? And I mean, if you do and you build it, great. That's a fantastic thing to do. But what I actually find could be very interesting here is even a short blog post where you discuss how like a recent development can be applied or built out. That's a portfolio item too. And I would actually prefer that one over a generic thing that lots of people do, because it shows that you can solve a problem and you're doing something that's different. And frankly, you're communicating well if you're writing, let's say, or you have a video or whatever. And so I would say, don't overthink it. Make small projects, small, simple projects. That's fine too. Try to be unique. If you're looking for data sets, a great place to start is something like Kaggle, but again, there's lots of open data sets nowadays. Pick something that is aligned with your career goals and spend a bit of time on it.
That's great. because I think, there's some other questions coming up around, how to look for potential volunteer positions, or how to sort of balance out, if you don't have really strong portfolio pieces, weaker ones, do you include those in the end of the day, or is it better just to not include those? So I guess there's a lot of questions coming up around, how to find the right experiences, or how to highlight the right projects in order to be noticed.
Yeah, so actually a few thoughts here, because one of the other things I often get after sessions like this, and this is, we're more flexible with Phase AI because we're obviously working with a lot of students, but back at my other companies, I would actually get emails from people asking to volunteer. And this is kind of like the hashtag open to work thing. If you're really busy and if you're really kicking butt, you probably don't have time to volunteer for a company. Also, I don't know if, like, there's this whole legal question on where can you accept unpaid work in a company. So you're actually, most hiring managers really panic when they get stuff like that, and it doesn't actually paint you in the positive light that you might think it does. So what I actually encourage here is volunteering, like actual volunteering for nonprofit organizations or charities. They're obviously very different. And I believe me, they have a lot of data challenges. So if you can come in and build a visualization for them on their donor pipeline, or help them figure out how to use Salesforce, as two examples, you'll probably get a job offer from them, number one, but number two, that's going to be a great story. And most charities are actually really happy to sing your praises afterwards as well. Whereas doing a volunteer project for a company, that's again really tough for the hiring manager to go out and say, we accepted unpaid labor and here's what they did, so people can do it too. So you can see how difficult it might be for them. The other thing that I would say here, though, in terms of as you're looking for projects and interesting things, is this is where I would say go to what the hiring managers are looking for. So to give you a few examples, there's a lot of interesting companies today that are, or there's a lot of companies, excuse me, that are interested in natural language processing. So anyone that emails me or has a landing page where they talk about recent developments, because NLP is changing every month. That's really, for the people working in NLP, it's exciting to see someone who's staying up to date. That'll be less relevant to a computer vision expert or a company hiring for a CV. So in that scenario, what you should do is, again, when you think about your 10-year vision, ask yourself, what are the projects that probably are a good launch point for that? And by the way, that might not necessarily be, I'm giving examples where it's data analysis. It might be design. It might be, again, meeting a data scientist who can convert a complicated topic into a clean architecture diagram and communicate it at an executive level is so beautiful and wonderful. And so those are examples of maybe less common portfolios that I think are just as powerful.
That's awesome. So I realize we only have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze two questions in on you here. Just one, if you can just briefly comment on privacy issues and confidentiality related to data in terms of, how do you actually share a project that has data like that? And then one that I think is really interesting and does really speak to this audience here, because, a lot of folks have been working on research papers. And so how might you take a paper-centric approach to your portfolio versus a project-centric approach, and really talk about, your role in contributing to that paper and working on that and highlighting, your capabilities there.
Sure. So I'll to start on the privacy side, oftentimes this is particularly true, I think, if people are coming from industry and shifting into a new role, because there's a good chance a lot of your work at your last employer probably is confidential, and you certainly shouldn't be just posting it. A common strategy that we find here is redoing the analysis on different data, if you possibly can. And of course, this assumes that the analysis itself wasn't proprietary. So if you were doing a regression model on a unique data set where you made some decisions about the regression model, let's say, within that context, you could maybe change the data set and show and describe the examples of why that was relevant or interesting. Unfortunately, if the project like the actual code, the process, and the data were all confidential, it's really difficult to make that a little more, to make that public. In which case, I would say try to get to the point where you have an analogy that isn't obvious to your employer and isn't giving away any secrets. That's really, really important. Same with data. When you're analyzing it, especially at the individual level, you always want to you definitely want to aggregate it to a level where it's not about the individual people, it's not personally identifiable. Most data sets, if you're using public ones, if there's a public data set with personally identifiable information, you probably shouldn't be using it. And you'll have to remind me of the last question.
Yes, just really quickly, commenting on paper-centric, if you have contributions to an academic research paper.
Right, great. So I'll answer that in two ways, actually. So one is, people often think that having a PhD automatically makes them more competitive when it comes to data science, and believe it or not, that's not always true. So I will start with this because I know we have a huge range of participants on this call. And so why do I bring that up here? Oftentimes, data science requires a combination of skills: the technical deep dives where you're doing the research, building something, but the ability to communicate the findings and evangelize them. And that part, a lot of people who are deeply academic really struggle with. And so so why do I bring this up here? Two reasons. The first is try to communicate your paper as a slide. So why was this interesting? Just because you found a new way to integrate partially differentiable equations, like, that's cool. I have no idea what that means probably. And so why is this an important field of work? Why is this hard? And what was your contribution? And of course, if your contribution was minimal, because sometimes that does happen, is you have like 12 co-authors on a paper, then you obviously still want it in your CV, but you might not want it in your actual portfolio. But the really key part here that also shows the hiring manager and recruiter that you're a great communicator, that you don't necessarily get lost in the weeds, is to take that abstract, let's say, or that high level finding, and communicate it without the jargon. Another way to think about it here actually is build an analogy, or explain what you're doing with an analogy that is in a different space, and ideally in the space that the company is working with, because again, then people will start connecting you to their problems and your research to their questions, and that could be really, really powerful.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. I think we've just gone a minute or two over time, so thank you for getting all those questions in.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. And so as I mentioned earlier too, you'll be receiving an email with a short summary of today, along with eventually we're going to be posting the video recording. And for everyone still on, the next seminar or the next webinar is going to be on March 3rd, on the nuances of data roles, and hybrid career trajectories, excuse me. So all of the details we talked about in terms of really showing why you're great for this role, whatever this role is, and how you strategize for those different types of data science roles and really stand out, we'll be discussing that. So we look forward to having you there, and this was a pleasure. Thanks everyone for having us.
Thank you so much.